Narcissists target empaths more frequently than other groups. They stay longer, absorb more damage, and are pulled back into the cycle more often. However, the same psychological mechanisms that make empaths vulnerable also provide a specific pathway for a permanent exit. To understand how that exit works, we have to look at why leaving a narcissist is so notoriously difficult for everyone else. It is not a matter of intelligence or willpower. It is a result of 3 specific psychological traps that keep the victim in orbit. We can map these traps on a cycle of the trauma bond. The first path is leaving in anger. Someone reaches a breaking point and walks out in a moment of rage or exhaustion. The narcissist knows exactly how to handle this because anger is still a form of connection. They exploit that energy with manufactured remorse and sudden apologies, pulling the person back into the cycle. The second path is leaving from exhaustion. This happens when a person simply runs out of energy to keep trying. Because their defenses are entirely down, they become vulnerable to a sudden return of the version of the narcissist they first fell in love with, the grand gestures and intense affection of those early weeks. The third trap is leaving logically. A person can read every article and identify the abuse intellectually, but the mind cannot easily override a nervous system that has been conditioned to associate the abuser with safety. The physiological craving for the partner often forces the victim back, regardless of what they understand. Tying these traps together is the psychological wait for closure. Victims stay tethered to the relationship while waiting for the narcissist to finally acknowledge the damage they caused. Since that acknowledgement almost never comes, the victim remains stuck in an unresolved loop with a person who has already moved on. Empaths navigate this landscape differently because they prioritize emotional temperature over behavioral evidence. While most people read what a person does or says, empaths focus on the quality of presence and the underlying energy behind the eye contact. This creates a unique problem during the mirroring phase. In the early stages of a relationship, a narcissist studies their target to learn what they value and what kind of partner they have always wanted. Then they actively reshape their own persona to reflect those traits back to the target. But as the relationship progresses, the empath detects a misalignment. The words and the physical behaviors still match, but the underlying energy feels empty. It's the sensation of sitting across from a loved one and realizing there is actually no one there. Because empaths are naturally self-reflective, they usually turn this initial confusion inward. They assume their own anxiety or past issues are causing the disconnect. They try harder, do more inner work, and take the narcissist's criticism seriously, missing the external manipulation entirely. This eventually leads to a research stage, where the empath discovers the clinical vocabulary for their experience, terms like gaslighting and trauma bonding. Even with this knowledge, they often remain physically trapped by the physiological conditioning of the nervous system. The decisive shift often happens in total silence. While sitting across from the narcissist, the empath stops analyzing and simply feels. In that stillness, they realize they are watching a performance, a stage set with nothing behind the walls. Once they perceive this hollowness, the love begins to dissolve. To see how the empath turns this into an escape, we have to look at empathy as a finite resource. An empath's defining trait is projecting compassion outward. They prioritize the needs of others as a default setting, often at their own expense. This endless outward flow makes them an ideal host for a narcissistic dynamic. The relationship depends on a partner who will consistently manage the other person's volatile emotions, find reasons to tolerate poor behavior, and provide endless patience. The dynamic breaks when the empath redirects that same depth of feeling and patience toward their own unacknowledged pain. They finally sit with their own experience with the same compassion they have always given to everyone else. When they stop minimizing their own trauma and finally witness themselves, a change occurs in their nervous system. The part of them that kept shrinking their own needs to accommodate the narcissist simply stops being available. This inward turn initiates a disorienting mourning process. The empath mourns a partner who never existed, the perfectly mirrored persona who made them feel understood in the early weeks. They are processing the death of a fiction, Grieving the illusion is the exact mechanism that destroys the trauma bond. By mourning the person who was never there, the empath kills the false hope the narcissist relied upon to maintain control. This processing creates a permanent exit through internal closure. The empath stops waiting for the narcissist to validate the abuse or offer an apology. By validating their own reality, they cut the psychological tether and remove the abuser from their internal narrative. This leads to genuine neutrality. On this spectrum of emotion, love and hate are both tethered to the other person. Hatred still requires ongoing energy and attention. The empath, however, moves entirely off the spectrum to indifference, where the other person no longer holds power in their nervous system. Third, they resolve the internal susceptibility that allowed the relationship to flourish. They identified the fawn response, or the belief that their value depends on how much they sacrifice. By healing these underlying patterns, they close the door on future manipulation. Escape, in this form, changes the individual's relationship with themselves. They transform from a person who manages everyone else's emotional temperature to someone whose identity no longer offers a hook for narcissistic control. As the narcissist loses control, they usually attempt hoovering, sending random texts or inside jokes to test the empath's availability. They are checking to see if they can still provoke a reaction. If that fails, they escalate to a second round of love bombing. But to an empath who has already seen the emptiness beneath the mask, this reads as a script being run. Watching a performance of love when the performer is visible removes any remaining ambiguity. The final desperate move is the smear campaign. The narcissist tells stories to mutual friends, framing the empath as the toxic party to provoke a defensive reaction and force them back into a hostile engagement. An empath who has found internal closure does not need to defend their narrative. Refusing to engage with the smear campaign is the clearest possible signal that the relationship is completely over. The empath achieves a permanent escape because the trait that once made them a target, their profound capacity to care, becomes an armor once it is directed inward. When they fully witness their own pain, the narcissist loses every point of leverage.